an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
So the Prime Minister says the bombing operation against Islamic State militants in Syria will require patience and persistence. His comments came after last night's dramatic 174-vote majority in favour of Britain joining the attacks. But the political fallout from the vote has centred on the 66 Labour MPs who backed the government, with tales of them receiving abuse and threats of retribution from left-wing activists. And this report from our political editor, Gary Gibbon, contains some strong language.
Tornadoes taking off from RAF Akrotiri in Cyprus, just a couple of hours after the Commons voted. At 2 in the morning, they started to return. Some missiles still visible and not dropped. The Ministry of Defence said they'd successfully bombed oil fields controlled by so-called Islamic State. The Prime Minister today was trying to manage expectations of early, big breakthroughs defeating IS in Syria.
We're going to need to be patient and persistent. This is going to take time. It is complex. It is difficult what we're asking our pilots to do, and our thoughts should be with them and their families as they commence this important work.
Hilary Benn, shame on you! Hilary Benn, shame on you!
The anti-war movement latched on to an unlikely new hate figure last night. The son of anti-war left-wing firebrand Tony Benn roused supporters of military action with a stirring speech contradicting his own leader, Jeremy Corbyn.
And we are here faced by fascists. Not just their calculated brutality, but their belief that they are superior to every single one of us in this chamber tonight and all of the people that we represent. They hold us in contempt. They hold our values in contempt. They hold our belief in tolerance and decency in contempt. They hold our democracy, the means by which we will make our decision tonight, in contempt. And what we know about fascists is that they need to be defeated. And it is why, as we have heard tonight, socialists and trade unionists and others joined the International Brigade in the 1930s to fight against Franco. It's why this entire House stood up against Hitler and Mussolini. It is why our party has always stood up against the denial of human rights and for justice. And my view, Mr. Speaker, is that we must now confront this evil. It is now time for us to do our bit in Syria. And that is why I ask my colleagues to vote for this motion tonight.
Jeremy Corbyn looked away. His deputy Tom Watson clapped, one of the 66 Labour MPs who voted for military strikes. Many Conservatives clapped him too. As he walked through the voting lobby, Hilary Benn was cheered like a conquering hero. There were kisses, cries of Hillary in 2016. Some people were moved to tears on your benches.
They were.
You saw them around you?
Yeah, I saw them around me, and I you know, I think that the applause that came was just because he just did speak to our emotions.
If I direct my closing remarks to my Labour friends and colleagues.
Some colleagues' reaction to the speech was friendlier than others. John McDonnell said of Hilary Benn this morning, it all sounded a bit like Tony Blair. Great words, but they end in disaster.
Actually, I think that's a very good analysis. I mean,
John McDonnell thinks Tony Blair's a war criminal, so yeah, where does that leave Hilary Benn?
Well, it was a brilliant speech, but it doesn't have a strategy behind it any more than David Cameron.
Some Labour MPs say they had an onslaught of threatening tweets and emails, which, some of them say, frightened off many Labour MPs from rebelling.
I hope you will feel collective guilt when hundreds of innocent people die as a result of that decision. Have a nice day. You evil effing bitch. I hope people remember what you have done.
That's a nice one.
Yeah.
Do you think some of these people are party members?
I think it's hard to tell.
Is it offensive to say one of these people who voted for action over Syria has blood on their hands? You wouldn't think that is particularly offensive, presumably.
Well, it's not threatening.
It's a political message, yeah.
Look,
what if they send images of dead babies, because they've been doing that to MPs?
Let's bear in mind
is that acceptable as well?
In a bombing campaign, lots of innocent people get killed.
So that's acceptable, isn't it?
Politics isn't a nice trade to get into. If you just want to be nice and touchy-feely, you should go into social work.
Another tornado leaves RAF Marham to bomb targets in Syria after a vote that exposed Labour's divisions and started a new chapter of British military action.
So, as we've heard, British fighter jets were in the air within an hour of last night's vote in favour of bombing. 4 RAF Tornadoes took off from their Akrotiri base in Cyprus to drop their payloads on the IS-controlled Omar oil fields in eastern Syria. The Defence Secretary today suggested the military campaign could last several years. But after one Conservative MP described local ground forces as bogus battalions, just who can the coalition rely on to take territory from IS? Here's our Foreign Affairs correspondent, Jonathan Rugman.
These oil wells, targeted in the Syrian desert last night, are thought to represent over 10% of so-called Islamic State's oil revenue. They were first occupied by the so-called Free Syrian Army in 2013, then by al-Nusra, an offshoot of al-Qaeda, which filmed these pictures. And that exposes a problem. It's hard to know whether friend or foe will fill the vacuum here when the bombing campaign eventually ends. And today, the American Secretary of State admitted he's still looking for Syrian and Arab ground troops to take up the battle.
I think we know it, that without the ability to find some ground forces that are prepared to take on Daesh, this will not be won completely from the air.
The RAF struck 6 targets in the Omar field, 35 miles inside the Syrian border. The nearest rebels that could fill any vacuum here are Kurdish forces in northern Syria known as the YPG. Not the 70,000 rebels identified as possible allies by David Cameron. They are mostly in the west. The Russians have been bombing some of these rebel groups as well as IS. And the real question may not be who are these 70,000, but rather how many of them will still be alive to expand and occupy liberated territory a few years from now. Until a few weeks ago, Karen von Hippel served in the US State Department helping draw up plans for Syria's future. And she says even fewer moderate fighters will be left the longer this conflict lasts.
Time is not on our side, and so the longer this goes on, the fewer partners we will have on the ground. They will leave or they will be killed, unfortunately.
These Kurdish forces may prove the most reliable partners for British jets. I understand the Americans recently equipped their commanders with iPads to help them transmit enemy coordinates so coalition jets can strike quickly. Though any desire for a Kurdish state here could prove a future nightmare for Western diplomats. Remote oil fields will surely prove easier targets than Raqqa, the IS capital, where jihadists can and do use civilians as human shields. If coalition airstrikes have made slow progress in the last 15 months, that's partly because of the desire to avoid civilian casualties.
They will not take strikes if they're concerned about civilian casualties, whereas the Russians have just joined the campaign and they have had many more strikes, but of course they're using cluster bombs and they're less concerned about civilian casualties.
So this estimate of this campaign lasting perhaps 3 years, does that sound about right to you?
Minimum of 3 years. I'm sure it'll be longer. I mean, I think this is a nasty enemy that we're dealing with, and they have morphed into several different countries, and they're spreading potentially further afield from Syria and Iraq, which is their headquarters.
So the involvement of these tornado jets may not be confined to Syria and Iraq. They will certainly help clear territory of IS fighters. But the hunt for allies who can hold and build ground is not as advanced as this coalition would like.
Well, I've been speaking to President Obama's special envoy for the global coalition to counter IS, Brett McGurk. I began by asking him whether the US policy is still to destroy Islamic State.
Well, we're at war with the Islamic State. We built a global coalition to degrade and ultimately destroy them, and that is certainly our goal, and that will be done by the combination of efforts. It's military, diplomatic, economic, political. But we really welcome, as President Obama said last night, the historic vote in the UK Parliament to begin airstrikes in Syria. We welcome the strikes that occurred last night at the Omar oil facility in Deir ez-Zor in Syria. This is a critical facility in which Daesh is able to fund its operations. So we're encouraged, but this will be a long campaign. It's going to take time. But we are intensifying our efforts across the board, and we're looking for all of our coalition partners to do the same.
There's obviously been a huge debate here about those airstrikes. Can we put them in some context? Is Britain's involvement now decisive? Does it make the difference between winning or losing?
Well, it's hard to say anything is going to be decisive in this campaign. This is going to be a long-term effort, but pressuring them in Syria is critical, and what the capabilities the UK can bring is both precision guided munitions with their brimstone munitions, making sure that we are very careful to avoid civilian casualties, and pressuring these networks across the board. The more strike assets we have in the sky at any given time, the more targets we are able to hit. We now have more intelligence on Daesh than we did even 3 or 4 months ago, and we don't want to leave any targets left alone because we don't have planes in the sky. So this is a very important decision. It's going to dramatically increase our effectiveness and allow us to really intensify the pressure campaign in Syria.
Can you then lay out what the military steps are now that you're bombing? You've also got special forces going in on the ground. Can you lay out what's supposed to happen?
Well, we have a number of things going on at the same time. We're doing things now that we could not have done, again, even just a few months ago. It takes time to set up the foundation to do these things. We're focused on critical areas all across the battle space in Syria and Iraq. There's a 98-kilometer strip of border that Daesh still controls with Turkey. We're working with Turkey to close that border, and we're working with Syrian opposition forces to pressure Daesh in that critical area. To the east in Syria, we're working with a coalition of Syrian Kurds and Syrian Arabs to begin to push down on Raqqa and cut off the critical road linkages between Iraq and Syria. That is ongoing, and they've had some real success retaking the town of Al-Hal and now pushing down south to retake some more territory. Our special forces, the advisors that will be going into Syria, will be helping to advise and assist in that efforts and others. Across the border in Syria, across the border in Iraq, we're now cutting off the main road networks between Mosul and Raqqa. The operation to retake Sinjar was critical to that. If you then go around to the Tigris River Valley, Iraqi forces are pushing up the Tigris Valley, beginning to impinge upon ISIL strongholds. They retook Beji, they retook and now secured the Beji oil refinery. If you go to the eastern Euphrates Valley, just west of Baghdad, we now have Iraqi security forces surrounding and now moving in to Ramadi, the iconic city of Ramadi, and Daesh is now taking civilian human shields into the center of the city to try to resist that attack. We are being very careful, very deliberate, but we now have Daesh surrounded in the city of Ramadi. So all of these simultaneous pressure points ongoing at the same time, we're at a point in this campaign that we're moving it now to a new stage and a new phase. And getting the UK in the skies with the coalition over Syria will help us dramatically increase that pressure. And the strikes they did last night are focused on the oil infrastructure to make sure that we're not only pressuring them on the ground, pressuring their leaders, making their fighters think twice, but also taking away their economic lifelines.
Do you agree that there are 70,000 moderate forces in Syria ready to fight now?
Well, there are about 70,000 moderate opposition forces. They are, of course, fighting on multiple fronts, and many of them right now are focused on the conflict with the regime.
So you'd
which is
agree?
why it is so important to get to a ceasefire against the regime, to try to focus our efforts on the threats and most importantly, the threat of Daesh.
So you would agree that that 70,000 is not a single coherent army in any stretch of the imagination?
Well, to bring coherence to the fight in Syria against Daesh, we have to advance the diplomatic political process, and that's exactly what we're trying to do.
And how do you bring them together through diplomacy if none of the rebel groups are taking part in the talks?
Well, in fact, in Saudi Arabia, in about a week from now, there's going to be a very broad opposition conference, which will include a number of armed groups with dramatic capacity on the ground, and this is part of the Vienna process. Everybody recognizes it cannot all be done externally. You have to bring the internal players to the table, and the process that is now getting underway in Saudi Arabia is designed to answer your very question.
Just finally, a couple of months ago, General Austin said that the $500 million effort to train Syrian forces had only resulted in 4 or 5 Syrian rebels being trained. How many more have you trained since?
Well, that effort is ongoing. What we're really focused on is making sure that we are supplying the forces that are in Syria now fighting Daesh. And in fact, if you take a map and just go north of Aleppo, there's a town called Mara. And then you can draw a line. We call it the Mari line. Daesh has tried to push west for some time. They've now reached really the extent of their western advance, because we're now beginning to, we've halted them, that took some time, and now we're beginning to roll them back. So some of these forces that we have trained have been involved in operations to retake some villages across the Mara line, and that's something that we are going to continue. That's what I mentioned at the beginning of the interview here, this 98-kilometer strip of border with Turkey. Look, make no mistake, this is extremely, extremely difficult. We are not putting U.S. combat troops on the ground in Iraq and Syria. Nobody wants to return to those days. We are putting advisors and special forces in, but we are relying on indigenous forces to take the fight to Daesh. And so that's difficult. It takes time to organize the forces. It takes time to build the relationships you need. But we have some more traction now, and you're going to see intensification across the board. But again, it's not going to be a linear process. It's not going to be a perfect process. But we have to pressure them across this battle space, because then they start to do stupid things. They travel around in groups, they come out of hiding, and we can kill the leaders, such as we did with Jihadi John in Raqqa only a couple weeks ago.
Mr. McGurk, thank you very much indeed for your time. Thanks.
Thank you. Honored to be here.